Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 11 this morning. Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. 2 years ago, in November of 2022, the Wall Street Journal ran a story entitled "The Life After War, The Men of Bravo Company." And this article highlighted, one of the men that this article highlighted was a guy by the name of Tyler Kohler. Now, Tyler was raised in a conservative Christian family. And when he was 18 years old, he went and joined the army. And one of the reasons he joined it was because he believed in this mission. He believed in a loving and just God. And he was deployed. His first deployment was with Bravo Company to Afghanistan. And he was a man of faith. And he would, before they went out on patrol, he would gather his squad together and they would pray. And in fact, the other guys in his squad would offer him money to cuss. Like he wouldn't even cuss, and we'll pay you money if you say this word. And he wouldn't do it because he saw it was an affront to not only to his mom who had raised him, but also to God. But like many of the men and women who have served in war in Afghanistan and Iraq for 20 years, while Tyler didn't have a physical wound, he came away with a moral wound. The article said, a soldier heads to a war zone with a carefully tuned moral compass that parents and preachers and teachers and friends have helped to calibrate. But in a combat zone, soldiers see, hear, and do things that aren't aligned with the true north of that moral compass. Kohler saw horrible things in Afghanistan. The killing of American and Taliban soldiers, but also the inadvertent maiming of children. He learned about the corruption in the Afghan government, and particularly the sexual abuse of young boys by corrupt Afghan police. And Kohler says, the faith that I had went away. I have hope in my heart that there's a higher being out there. So these situations, these circumstances that he found himself in, the faith that he had when he went there was challenged. And by the time he came home, that faith wasn't there anymore. And when we come to the book of Habakkuk, so we have context of what's happened, is that the situation in Judah and Jerusalem, so Jerusalem's the capital of Judah, is that it tested the hope and faith of the good people, the righteous people of the country. There was national corruption. So what's happened is that Judah had a good king by the name of Joaz. Or Josiah. Josiah. So Josiah was a good king. And while he was reigning, what did they find? They found the book of the law in the temple. And they read it and they're like, why? We're not following this at all. And so Josiah puts in reforms. And Jerusalem and Judea experience a time of prosperity. They experience a time of good things happening. But in 609 BC, Pharaoh Necho from Egypt moves up to confront Assyria. But on his way, Josiah, who got a little too big for his britches, said, hey, I'm going to confront Pharaoh Necho. And in battle, Josiah dies. And his son Jehoahaz became king. But that lasted 3 months. And then Pharaoh Necho comes and says, no, I want the other son, Jehoiakim, to be king. And Jehoiakim was a bad guy. And he undoes much of the reforms, much of what his father had put in place. So the prosperity and the good times that Judah had experienced suddenly started going away. Habakkuk, along with the righteous people of Judah, experienced a time when God's law was followed, and then they experienced life when the law was ignored. And so it's no wonder that as we come to this book, it sounds a whole lot like a lament. Like this question of, God, where are you in this? So a couple interesting things about this book. First of all, it's a vision given to the prophet Habakkuk. So he has this vision, and he writes down what he saw. The second is that rather than in this vision, God telling Habakkuk, hey, go, this is the message I have, go and tell the people this message, what we have is this question and response, kind of this dialogue between Habakkuk and God. And that is what Habakkuk writes down. It's this dialogue in this vision that he has with God. And the very first part of this vision, where Habakkuk says, how long, O Lord, must I call for help? This kind of sets the theme, the tone for not only this morning, but really the entire book. So, we, much like Habakkuk, have those times of frustration, of doubt, of confusion, when it seems like God is silent. Like, God, where are you? What's happening? Why are you allowing this? So it could be from facing some awful circumstance like Tyler did in Afghanistan. It could be from national crisis, just looking around like, what in the world is going on out there? It could be from having some intellectual doubts. It could be from a family crisis or situation. And all these things could have us crying out to God, lamenting, like, God, where are you? What in the world is happening here? So here's the question I think we should have before us this morning. It's this: what do we do when we have honest questions to God? What do we do when we have honest questions to God? Do we just ignore them? Do we hope that they go away? What do we do when we have honest questions to God? So let's take a look here at Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. This is the message that the prophet Habakkuk received in a vision. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere, I cry, but you do not come and save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. The law has become paralyzed, and there is no justice in the courts. The wicked far outnumber the righteous, so that justice has become perverted. Since this is a vision, Habakkuk sees himself. He sees himself offering these questions to God. So Habakkuk is probably offering and representing all the righteous in Jerusalem who have these questions, who have these wonderings, who are crying out to God, lamenting over the reality that is found in their land. In verse 2, this cry captures the frustration and desperation of a person who has prayed and pleaded and has heard nothing, who has seen no movement of God. He sees what is wrong and wonders, where is God at? Where's God? Like, I see what's going on. I see the evil. I see the corruption. Why isn't God intervening? Right? God, how long? How long do I have to cry out? How long do I have to cry out for help? How long is this going to take? And why aren't you moving? Why aren't you doing anything? And then in verses 3 and 4, we see God's apparent inactivity leaves Habakkuk confused. Why doesn't he step in? Why doesn't God step in and do something? Why doesn't he send them a deliverer, right? Why doesn't he send them a king like David? Why doesn't he send them a king like Josiah, who will come and make the necessary reforms, who will get them back on track? Why is God apparently doing nothing? Why does he allow evil? Why does he allow people to oppress others? Why do those who seem to cheat and kill to get ahead, why do they seem to prosper? And worst of all, why is God's law not being taught? Why is it being ignored? Why is justice not happening? Questions. What we see here is questions to God are part of authentic faith. Questions to God are part of authentic faith. Because they remind us that we live in a world that's still corrupted by evil and sin. And it's going to cause us to wonder sometimes, God, where are you? What's going on? What is happening? So now we move into God's surprising response to Habakkuk's question. The Lord replied, "Look around at the nations. Look and be amazed. For I am doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe even if someone told you about it. I am raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and violent people. They will march across the world and conquer other lands. They are notorious for their cruelty and do whatever they like. Their horses are swifter than cheetahs and fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their charioteers charge from far away. Like eagles, they swoop down to devour their prey. On they come, all bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind, sweeping captives ahead of them like sand. They scoff at kings and princes, scorn at all their fortresses. They simply pile ramps of earth against their walls and capture them. They sweep past all like the wind and are gone, but they are deeply guilty, for their own strength is their God." God answers Habakkuk, but not in the way he expected. God told Habakkuk, first of all, to look around. Okay? Look around at the nations. Look at what is happening. So Habakkuk is focused on Judah, Jerusalem, on what's happening around them. That's his focus. His focus is there, but God says, no, look around, look at what is happening, because I'm at work. So Habakkuk doesn't see God at work, but God says, I'm at work. I am doing something in your own day that you won't believe. Like you're not going to, like even if somebody came and told you, hey, Habakkuk, this is what's happening, you won't believe it. You won't believe what I'm about to tell you. See, God is always working, even when we don't see it. And he's doing things that we don't always understand. This is not the answer Habakkuk was hoping for. Because in verses 6 through 9, what we see is that God says, I am raising up the Babylonians. The Babylonians are going to be my tool. So what is the answer to violence in Jerusalem and Judah. The violence of the Babylonians. And God does not describe them in flattering terms here, right? They are bent on cruelty and savagery. The way that he describes them are cheetahs, wolves, eagles, all predators, all known for their swiftness, their cruelty, their savagery. Like, this is who is coming. This is what's going to happen. This is what I am doing. Oh, what, God? This does not make sense. Doesn't make sense at all. You know, these guys are strong. There's no one that can stand before them. What's going to happen? You know, these Babylonians are so certain of their strength that they laugh at every other empire. They laugh at all other kings. They laugh at princes. They laugh at fortified cities. They laugh at it all. No one can stand before them. But notice also in verse 11, though God is going to use them, what is their reality? They're already judged. Just because God uses a person or a people doesn't mean that they are right. Doesn't mean that God approves of what they do. He says they're already judged. Why? Because their God is their own strength. That's what they worship. Yes, I'm going to use them, but they're already judged. They are evil. They are evil. So that does beg the question, why is God using the Babylonians? What is God up to? Well, there are two things that I think we need to remember. First of all is that he is using the Babylonians to carry out his promise. When God established the covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai, he tells them what? He tells them, if you keep my covenant, you're going to stay in the land and you're going to be blessed. But if you break my covenant, if you don't follow my law, what's going to happen? You're going to lose this land. It's going to be taken away from you. And Israel and then Judah, all through their history, have shown and demonstrated time after time after time that they are not going to follow the covenant. And what has just happened is a perfect example of that. While Josiah, who was a good king, was in charge, they followed the covenant. But when he died, what happened? They abandoned it. And so God is raising up the Babylonians to do what he has promised to do. But the second reason what God is up to, and we need to remember, is that the vocation or the job of Israel was to be a light to the nations to prepare their way for the Messiah. So that when the Messiah came, the whole world would know who he was or is. But they have failed in that task because rather than being God's covenant people, they wanted to be like every other nation around them. So how does God prepare for the way of the Messiah? He sends people who know his law into exile, and so that when the Messiah comes at just the right time, as Paul says in the book of Romans, at just the right time, when Paul goes on his missionary journeys to share the gospel, where does he go first? To these little pockets of Jewish synagogues, to people who know the law. God is still faithful to his covenant, to what he is doing, even though it's not the way that we may have done it. God is still faithful. He is still working out his plan to bring redemption and restoration into the entire world. So what does this 2,600-year-old prophecy have to do with us, right? Because this already happened. It's not like we're waiting around for this prophecy to come to fulfillment. It has already happened. So what does it have to do with us? Well, Habakkuk shows that trust and uncertainty can coexist. That we can trust in the goodness and love and promise of God and yet still be uncertain about what is happening in this moment. His lamenting didn't mean that he had lost his faith. It was, in fact, a crucial part of his faith as he struggled to make sense of what he believed about God and the reality that he experienced in life. Questioning doesn't make us faithless, but it invites us into a deeper relationship with God. It is part of our faith journey. And I think this is so crucial for us to be able to do. To be able to ask questions of God. God, what in the world is going on? I know of too many people who have walked away from following Jesus because they couldn't make sense of life. And one of the gifts that God has given to his people is the gift of lamenting. God, life is hard. Life doesn't make sense. And it seems like in this moment when I cry out to you, you are not listening to me. Like we need that opportunity. We need to be able to do that. Because most of us have had those moments of wondering, of questioning, why is God allowing this to happen? Why hasn't he answered my prayer? Why is he allowing evil to flourish? Why doesn't he send revival? Where is God? Right? At one time or another, I'm sure that one or more of those questions have run through your mind. And it's not wrong to ask the questions. And in fact, since this is a vision that God gave to Habakkuk, so even the part of Habakkuk questioning God, that's part of this vision. What we see here then is that God wants our questions. He wants us to feel that tension between living in an evil world and having our faith and hope in him and his love and his promises. And I think this ties into where we were last week with what is truth. And truth being the faithfulness of God. That when it comes to our lament, when it comes to questioning, what we need is an anchor point in our faith. Because otherwise we will throw everything out. But we need to have an anchor point in our faith. And for me, that anchor point is the resurrection of Jesus. If I can be certain that Jesus rose from the dead like he promised, then even if I don't understand anything else about this world, I can be confident that he will keep his promises. And so when I have that anchor in my faith, I can question God, where are you? Why doesn't this make sense? What are you up to? And so that leaves us with trusting God in these unexpected, hard circumstances of life. In the book of Romans, which the Apostle Paul wrote, in chapter 8, he's having this discussion about our future glory, our future hope. And what in the world? Why isn't this happening? What's going on? And in that context, he says this in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And I know this is one that many of us know. Paul writes, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. So for people who are experiencing hardship, experiencing difficulty, who are experiencing persecution in Rome, who are seeing the Romans, right, go back, especially for the Jewish Christians, going back and conquering Jerusalem and doing all that, Paul says, hey, remember this. That in spite of all these bad circumstances, in spite of all the negative things, in spite of all that is coming against you, remember this, God uses it all for your good. One of the things that we need to remember is that God will not waste our pain, but rather God will use our pain to transform us, to make us, to mature us into the people that he wants us to be. God will not waste our pain. God's answers to our questions will not always align with our expectations or make sense to us. The answer to Israel's violence is the violence of the Babylonians. As we'll see next week, this makes absolute no sense to Habakkuk. Like, what in the world? The Babylonians are more wicked than Judah. Why would God use them? And this is why faith is crucial. It reminds us that just because God's plan doesn't make sense to us, that doesn't mean his plan isn't good. Just because we don't understand it doesn't mean that it's not good. So if we're committed to God, if we've pledged our loyalty to him, if we believe in his promises, then we can trust his wisdom and plan. So why would God allow the evil and pain of this world into our lives? Well, there's two reasons that I can think of. Why doesn't God insulate us from the pain and the evil of this world? The first reason is because God wants to transform our character. He wants us to be like Jesus. So when we're talking about living like Jesus, more than anything, what we mean by that is that we live with the character of Jesus, his love, his grace, his mercy, his compassion, his forgiveness, his patience. That's what we want to demonstrate. And so our character, our motivations have to be transformed. And sometimes God uses pain and evil to get there. So in 2 Corinthians, Paul is having this discussion with the Corinthians of why he is an apostle. Because there's these super apostles, in quotes, that's what Paul calls them, the super apostles, who's saying Paul isn't an apostle at all. Paul's weak. He does this. And what Paul says, he goes into this whole thing about boasting, like this is what I've accomplished and this and this and this. And then he says this, he says, to keep me from being proud, to keep me humble, he has given me a thorn in the flesh. And I've pleaded 3 times for God to take it away. He said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. See, Paul's character still needed to be transformed because he had a tendency to pride and to boasting. His character needed to be transformed. And so does ours. Dallas Willard said this once, and I've used this many different times. He said, I can trust Jesus to go into the temple and flip the tables, to cleanse the temple. I don't trust myself to do that. Why? Because we can trust in Jesus' character, and our character still needs some refinement. It still needs some transformation. We still need to learn to love better. We still need to forgive, and all that. Our character needs to be refined. The second reason why God might allow evil and pain into our lives is so that we can connect with people, we can comfort them, and we can help them. In Hebrews, right? In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, the writer of Hebrews is talking about Jesus, why Jesus is better than all the other high priests. And this is what he says. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he has faced all the same testings we do, yet he did not sin. Jesus understands us. He became a man, a human being, so we can know that he identifies with us. And so when Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, he says, all praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort. He comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others when they are troubled. We will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. We live in an evil world, and God doesn't insulate us from the evil of this world. Why? So we can comfort those around us. So that we will be able to identify with them. So why does God allow the evil in this world? So we can represent him well. And we can be a comfort to those around us. When it comes to discipleship, the developing the character of Jesus, we want to achieve that through worship. We want to achieve it through Bible studies. We want to achieve it through conferences. We want to achieve it through prayer. We want the mountaintop experiences. And yet God still seems to use difficulties, loss, grief, illness to help us learn that his grace is what we need and that we are to trust in his timing, as the Bible says, at just the right time. At just the right time, God shows up with what we need. Habakkuk had questions for God. Questions like, why is evil prospering? Why isn't God rescuing us? And God's response to Habakkuk was, he was working. He was just working in an unexpected way. Like Habakkuk, we can bring our honest questions to God. Remember, God is working even when we don't understand his ways. We are to trust in his goodness even when the world seems to be falling apart around us. So here's our big idea this morning. When life doesn't make sense, trust God. When life doesn't make sense, trust God. Remember why he has worked in the past, or remember the way he has worked in the past. So one of the things we want to do is remember what God has done in the past, how he has blessed us, how he has provided for us, and we want to remember his promises. Remember what he has promised for us. New life. He has promised that Jesus would come and make everything right. He has promised us new heaven, new earth, and to live forever with him. Remember also your commitment that you have made to him, that you have pledged your loyalty, your allegiance to Jesus. Remember that commitment. We are to trust in God's goodness, even when the world seems to be falling apart around us. So trust in his plan, right? Trust in his grace and his love. We do that by living faithfully in all situations. So we demonstrate our trust in God by living faithfully in all situations. Here's our challenge this week. Thank God. Thank God. And part of that is the reason for the challenge is because we're in the month of November, Thanksgiving, right? And I think it's important for us not only to express gratitude, but to actually give thanks to the giver of all things, right? We can all say, oh, I'm so grateful for this or that, but what really makes the difference is when we thank God for what he has done, for his gifts. So we want to thank God, but besides that, gratitude does two things. It reminds us that there is still good in the world, right? We can get so hung up on the evil and the pain, we forget that there's good. There's love, there's beauty, there's all sorts of wonderful things out there. And so we want to be reminded that there is still good in the world. But second, it reminds us that God has been at work in our lives. Like God has still blessed us. God has still provided. God has still done. done all these things. So while this area it might not make sense, we know that God is at work, that he has blessed us. And these realities then counter the doubts that come in when questions enter our lives. We have lived long enough to know that life doesn't turn out as planned, that the world is still corrupted by evil. This reality will often bring not only discouragement, but also doubt into our lives. When we have questions, we can voice them to God. We can lament. But we also need to remind ourselves of God's promises. We can't just always be questioning God. We also need to be reminded, this is what God has promised, this is what God has done, and build our faith on that. Build our faith on what we know about God.